I'm Bernard Welch. I'm going to be guiding you through today's agenda. We've got 4 speakers today, all related to this month's theme of innovation in a time of crisis. Hello, good morning, George.
Hello.
Could I ask you to just switch off your camera and mute yourself, please, if that's okay, just to preserve bandwidth. Thank you. My colleague Arno will also be assisting me and take us through the agenda. Arno, can you show yourself, please? Introduce yourself quickly.
Hi, good morning. It's me, Arno. I work for the Leicester Innovation Hub. Most of you know me already. I work on knowledge exchange activities with my colleague Benoit here. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you.
Introducing myself again.
So I think we have 4 speakers today. You've all seen the agenda, I believe. Before we go into the first talk by Professor Stephen Wood, who's a Professor of Management at the University of Leicester, we've got a very short introductory video by the manager of the Leicester Innovation Hub. So we'll play that straight away, and then we'll go into the first talk by Professor Stephen Wood. I should say that after each talk, there's going to be Q&A sessions. There'll be live Q&A sessions, so you'll have an opportunity to ask the speakers lots of questions. I would prefer, if you can, to put your email us your questions to Leicester Innovation, leicinnovation@le.ac.uk, or just type it into the meeting chat. Actually, that'd be the easiest thing. Type the questions into the meeting chat as we go along, and we'll try and pick those up. So, right, without further ado, Sandeep, if you're there, would you mind playing Rajinder's introduction video, please?
Hi everyone, my name's Rajinder Bui. I am the Innovation Hub Manager here at the Leicester Innovation Hub, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Innovation Friday. It's a little strange doing this by video, and for the time being I think this is becoming the norm, and so I think all of us are getting new skills and new ways of working during this time of social distancing and lockdown. Ordinarily, as you know, Innovation Friday is about bringing businesses, entrepreneurs, academics, students and our startups together to have conversations around innovation. In the current environment, we are pleased that we've been able to move this activity, and really thankful that technology is enabling us to bring together our enthusiastic and active community for today's event. We are facing unprecedented impact on both economy and businesses, and we have had a number of businesses contact us really looking at how they can accelerate their innovation ambitions and really look at how the challenges of COVID can be overcome. The Leicester Innovation Hub are all working from home and very much adapted our delivery to enable your innovation ambitions and really work with you during this time whilst we're working from home. Innovation Friday really remains one of our regular engagement platforms for us to share good practice and enable the community to meet, have a chance to discuss new ideas, ideas that you've wanted to get underway, and really have the chance to discuss those both one-to-one and also ask questions about any developments that you're making in regards to those. I hope you enjoy this insightful, and make sure that you do take advantage of this afternoon's networking opportunities. I wish you a really good day and look forward to seeing you in person in the near future. Thank you, and look after yourselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sandeep. So now we're going to show our first talk by Professor Stephen Wood, entitled Homeworking and the New Normal. So Sandeep, if you wouldn't mind setting that video, please.
I'm Stephen Wood, a work psychologist and human resource specialist. I've done recently work on home working and other forms of remote working, and also I did work on the effects of the last recession on well-being and absenteeism and presenteeism. Gini Rometty, the executive director of IBM, was on a Newsnight only the other night saying that the pandemic would accelerate trends that are already underway. She was obviously alluding to digital developments and remote working. And you might say, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? And I recall similar things were said about video conferencing and air travel after 9/11. Well, and that just didn't happen, did it? So there's nothing inevitable about future developments. It's going to depend on millions of decisions by governments and employers, and also, hopefully, employees, what they choose to do and so on. Today, I want to concentrate on home working as the core of remote working. And I want to do this both as an end in itself and as a means to learning about our organisations and employees. Firstly, home working as an end in itself is really needed because as business people, we need to say what role home working could, will, or should play in our future businesses. It's the other side of the coin that's often talked about now about does the office have a future? So when we return to work, to our workplaces, that is, as the pandemic subsides, we have a decision to make. Do we have more or less of it? Also, concentrating on home working as a means to learning, we can evaluate how the lockdown has gone. Can we learn from the way we've handled home working? What can we learn about our employees, about the way they've handled and taken to home working? So just as in society, people have been saying the pandemic has given us a mirror on our society, so we might say the same about home working, giving us a mirror on our organisations and help us to develop the new and better normal. Now, this is consistent with what we call evidence-based management, which is analogous to evidence-based medicine. It's not evidence-based management or medicine. It's not a blind following of science, to use the government's favourite phrase at the moment. It's more a case of what the president of the Royal Society called the heeding of science advice. Now, evidence-based management requires coupling general knowledge gained from social science, psychology, and other disciplines, including history, with our judgments about our local and individual situations. Just as a doctor comes with his or her bag of knowledge they got when they were at university and medical school, and also they've kept abreast of the literature and so on, and recent developments. They couple that with a detailed knowledge of the patient, and then they diagnose an illness and a treatment. So in the case of home working, we consider firstly what evidence do we have from social science, and there's quite a bit. And then we evaluate thus far how we have handled the home working in the pandemic in our organisations and how it's affected our employees. And we combine these and we can come up with some judgments that will help us move forward. And what I'm doing today is trying to help you raise some questions that might help you do that. Now, in considering the pandemic, there's 4 things to look at, aren't there? There's the lockdown event itself. There's the home working that we've been talking about, and which has been the centre of everything in the last few weeks. And then there's the transition period, how we move back to our workplaces. And then there's the new normal, and I don't think we'll have much time to talk about that now, and it's too far ahead. So I'll concentrate on the lockdown event and the home working itself. The lockdown event is important. It's not a case of bygones are bygones. We couldn't do any better than we did before because we didn't have much time. But we can learn from it. It's a learning chance to learn. How did we handle that lockdown event? We know it came sudden. We didn't have a lot of chance to plan, and so on. So I think the basic question here is, to what extent did we leave employees in the lurch to their own devices, if you like? What assumptions do we make about their lives, their home, their ability to work at home, their IT facilities? These are very nitty-gritty and vital things. Are we assuming their mobile devices were the latest generation? Were they compatible with our systems? What about those people living in remote areas where the line speeds are low and fluctuating, such as Rutland? What do you do about any shortages of company laptops? Do we actually have enough? And then the problem of sourcing them, given the Chinese lockdown and so on and so on. To what extent did we involve our employers? Did we have much choice? Did we have time to? Could we have done more involvement? And what's the cost of not involving them more? And now, although it may be too late, maybe we should have done it before, do we need to serve our employees to find out what they think? How do we find out more about what they think and so on? So that's what we might want to learn, and how we might want to learn from the lockdown event, as I call it. Now moving on to the actual experience of home working. We're particularly interested in employees' well-being for obvious reasons, but also we're interested in whether they were able to work normally and as efficiently as normal. And what's the relationship between them? Did the well-being have good effects and therefore good effects on performance, or was their well-being bad and therefore had effects on performance? Or is it possible their well-being was bad but it didn't affect their performance? So there's several possibilities. And this is where the evidence base of social science comes in. And the first important point to say is that modern psychology suggests there's three characteristics of jobs which make for high well-being. That job demands are important, the autonomy the people have is important, and the support they have. Job demands, autonomy, and support. So good jobs are ones which are challenging but not too strenuous. The job demands are challenging but not too strenuous. They have access to resources and able to do their job, and particularly levels of autonomy that allows them to make decisions. And then, of course, that they are supported. They feel that they've got supportive relationships from their line managers, their peers, and in the case of home working, it would be their family and relatives, and so on. Now, these three factors and support affect well-being, stress levels, motivation, work to family conflict, and in turn performance. And these are constant, if you like, factors across all workplaces. So the location is not the central point. Where the location of work comes in and their working arrangements comes in is that they affect these things. They affect the demands made on people, the autonomy they have, and the support they have. So what we need to ask is, during the home working period, which is still going on now, what has happened to the levels of these things, the levels of demands, the levels of support, the levels of autonomy? And also, very, very important when you think about these questions of well-being, what's the fluctuations? Because at least in normal time, the evidence is that fluctuations in these things actually have as much, if not more, effect than levels, because people get used to the level. So women with children may have high demands, but providing that they've coped and they've habituated to it, it's not such a problem. It's when suddenly there's a big demand increase, and then they have to start making adjustments in their lives, or they get stressed, and also they worry about whether they can fulfill it because it's bigger than they're normally used to. So let's just speculate before we look at the evidence. What might we have expected home working in general, not just in the pandemic, to do? Well, I think job demands can go either way. People may reduce their demands because they're not being monitored so much, or there's not so much work. On the other hand, they may increase them because they feel that they're not being observed so much, therefore they have to be shown to be committed to their work, and they can also get some momentum to their work, of course. And one, of course, side effect of home working is that people are not commuting to work, so they have more time. Almost by definition, home working gives some more autonomy, and in very subtle ways, like when you immediately walk in your office in the morning and you see your line manager, you're conscious of his or her control over you, however strong that is. But that doesn't exist when you're at home. You don't see your manager immediately you walk into the office. Well, what supports people have will vary in home working. And this is a very important point, because in the past there's been evidence to suggest that people feel that their land managers are actually not that happy with them working at home, and this discourages people from using it. But on the other side of the coin, where managers are signalling that they're happy with it, then this has a very positive effect on well-being. It's a symbolic thing. And people then reciprocate the commitment to the firm by working hard. Well, that's conjecture. What about my research? Well, my research, in normal circumstances we're talking about here, not in the pandemic, where there's been an element of voluntarism, and in some cases it's because people want to work flexibly, and in some cases people work 1 or 2 days a week. The evidence is that actually perceived demands, how people see their job demands, actually go up. And this could be because they're reciprocating their commitment and so on. But the important point is not so much that, but it doesn't have an effect on well-being. People don't feel any more stressed just because their demands are bigger than they would be if they were working in the office, or we're comparing them with people who work in the office. And in some senses, it can even have a positive effect, this demand, have a positive effect on motivation, this increased work, because their anxiety is reduced, and this is particularly the case in self-employed people. There's no fear about getting fired or something, or not getting work in the case of the self-employed. And there's increased enthusiasm for work, and this leads actually to have negative effects on work-family conflict. So you have this positive well-being effect with a negative effect on family-work conflict, and I coined the term enthusiasm-based work to family or home life conflict. Enthusiasm-based work to family conflict. And in the case of autonomy or support, then we would expect some increase in both of these. And this gives more energy and time to develop studies of home working outside of the pandemic. People talked about it gives me thinking time, and this particularly obviously is managers that are all the time inundated with interruptions and so on. They have a thinking time, and people sometimes think my thinking time Friday, for example, when I stay at home. Other research, not my own, has highlighted 2 big worries about home working. The one is this feeling of isolation, and the second one is fears that your career will not progress so well because you're not visible to the manager and you may appear not committed. And you feel out of things, as it were. Now, that's the sort of brief overview of the home working research. But before we move on to just speculate more about the effects of the pandemic, I think we must stress there are some very obvious differences between home working in the past and this period that we're experiencing right now. The first one is that it's enforced, and it's enforced on companies and it's enforced on employees. But that may not matter too much in this case, because people will know they're all being treated the same. We're all in the same boat together, and I'm not being interrupted by emails or I'm used to bringing home work and so on in some cases. So there's not a lot of problems. The thing here, though, is that you must allow for the fact that some people have a history of home working and they're going to cope better. But the second thing, it's prolonged. It's prolonged, and it's 7 days a week. And many, if not most, people's relaxation and recovery from work involves outside activities. And this is a big cost in terms of there's not a natural recovery from work, which we know from stress literature is really important. Accumulated stress gets worse and worse. In my case, for example, it's been a hell of a job. I'm used to working at home, but I feel hemmed in. And above all else, my 3 recovery modes are swimming, Leicester City Football Club, or Leicester football in general, and going to restaurants, which in some sense is the lifeblood of professional home workers. The third thing, this homeworking has been going in a context of uncertainty about the nature of the virus and the trajectory of the virus and the way the governments handle it. And so, uncertainty is itself a stressor. It makes you anxious. You don't feel you can rely on people around you, and so on and so on. And it reduces a sense of coherence and clarity about the environment and manageability of your lives. It reduces a sense of powerlessness. This is why actually when we first went into lockdown, a lot of people either deliberately or were being told by newspapers that they should establish a routine and begin to manage and plan things better. And people did that. We had to spend a lot of time getting deliveries and so on. And that gave you a sense of agency, which countered this sense of powerlessness. But that's beginning to wear off now. But on top of the pandemic, there's always, and it's increasingly so, I suspect, there's uncertainty about how you can trust management. What are they going to do if I'm ill? What's going to happen when I go back to work? Will I still have a job? Will it be changed and so on? So that amplifies uncertainties about the pandemic, and particularly the messages that are coming from management may just be mirroring the government's, and there's a lot of uncertainty attached to the government's proposals, and then it's magnified by how we communicate to our workforces. There's increasing job security on top of all these things as well. But I think the last point to stress, which is that employees have been away from their workplaces, and they may see pluses to this. And we certainly shouldn't romanticize their workplaces. If the opposite of home working is often seen to be open plan offices, then you can't romanticize them. The evidence on open plan offices is that, particularly on the health level, that they have negative consequences. That a lot of spread of germs, the air quality, the feeling of being interrupted all the time, the noise levels have been shown, particularly in Scandinavia, fun enough. They've spent a lot of time on this open plan literature research, and that creates problems. In fact, there is evidence, and would be from myself, that people feel actually healthier than they felt for a long time because they're free from the germs of the office and the commuting and so on. In fact, my doctors noted that. In fact, the decline of people coming to GP practice isn't just because they were put off by the propaganda about the NHS, but they actually are healthier or not getting so many things. And of course, alongside that, they've been washing their hands more regularly as well. So we've got the evidence, we know it's different, but what do we need to know about how people have been reacting to this homeworking and what they have done, and what kind of questions could we ask? I think the first thing to say to you is that people have been forming views of this. People have been forming views of this, and this is information for you. And I think we can think in terms of two stereotypes, if you like, two ideal types, we call them in social sciences. Some will have adjusted readily to it and even changed their physical space and arrangements so that they happily become habituated, or if they like it. They may not be ready to come back to work. They may want a bigger share of home working when we finally return to work. On the other hand, there may be those that are feeling it much too isolated and lonely, cannot really concentrate with all the interruptions either from care responsibility or from the coming down the line from the company or from other emails or simply the social media and so on. And they miss the workplace of colleagues, and they reinforce a sense that a major motivation of going to work is to mix with people. I like to get out of the house. It's made me realise, someone said to me, how I do need to get out of the house. And this particularly relates to an age group that tends to get overlooked in this discussion about the pandemic. We've been talking a lot about youngsters it's okay for them to roam the streets because they're not in any violent form. And then we've got the over 70s and so on. But there's a big group of people between 45 and 70 now who are key to our organisations, and these may be, and particularly women, but not necessarily, these may be exactly the group that has said, it's made me realise that I want to come back to work to social. The kids should, that group of workers. So the bottom line is, we need to know more about how these people are feeling before we make decisions about our home working. But the point is, they will have strong views about this. So it's a very easy opportunity. It's not a case of trying to struggle or having hourly long working parties. People have formed views of this, and you need to tap into this. The negative aspects of home working, the isolation, and the career thing, I don't think this will be too bad. The isolation will have been for some groups. I'm isolated from the politics, isolated from my career development. I don't think that's going to be such a big problem because people will realise we've all been in the same boat. And people will have been keen to do that extra mile, I suspect, partly because they care for the company, but also it's been give you a sense of doing something, a sense of purposeness. But it is important to stress that they will have missed out on organisational involvement opportunities. They may have had more autonomy, but the organisational opportunities such as working in a team, job rotation, even their appraisal and development systems, these will have not taken place. And it's these things that give purpose to life. You have a lot of autonomy, makes you happy. It doesn't necessarily make you feel a sense of purpose. And that's where the organisational involvement, the attachment to the organisation, the things you do, and not enough is done, in my opinion, to involve people in the wider organisation through quality circles, problem-solving groups, etc., etc. This is what gives purpose to people's lives. And happiness is not the same as meaningfulness. These are two separate dimensions of well-being to consider. The last thing I want to say about home working and speculating, I think a lot of people have been overworking, or they've been working more, and this may or may not have affected their well-being, and it's something we need to take account of. And we want to learn from these people. And we must, of course, remember that we're also going to have to take account of the fact that we are doing things that are effectively recessionary actions. We're going to start cutting wages, maybe we're reducing our employment levels, we're stopping training, maybe those sorts of things we do in recession. And that has to be taken into account. That's going to override a lot of things. And we may see a lot of presenteeism coming back to our organisations, people coming back to work when they're not well, not just because of the virus, but in other illnesses, which we don't necessarily want to encourage because of this recession. So, in conclusion, we have an opportunity to learn here about our employees, about home working, and make decisions about its role in the future, which could be made for a quite exciting future. And it's not a choice between home working and site locations. It's a whole gamut of different forms of working, including people working in cafes and other forms of work. So I just want to conclude by saying I've encouraged you to think about these things and give you some frameworks for thinking about these things. But I just want to conclude with a few questions you might want to ask as you start to do your investigations. To what extent were employees and even senior managers left to their own devices when the lockdown happened? Are we in danger of creating a polarisation between those who can work at home and those who can't work at home for whatever reason? To what extent should we be concerned that once people have worked at home, they will develop an appetite for it? Has decision making improved, in fact? For example, being quicker and more consensual? Or has it been thwarted, for example, by the technology and indecisiveness? Have we spotted meetings that need not happen or could be virtual across sites? Or what about workers and employees? Have they learned through organising their work at home better ways of doing things? To what extent have employees been able to achieve more or lost motivation through not being around others or feeling left out? Should we be ensuring maximum employee involvement and building on the opportunity the virus has created through putting health and safety in the spotlight? And I guess my motivation in giving this talk is actually to say yes, the answer is we should. Last few questions. with formal evaluations of the lockdown and learning take place in organisations, or will we simply muddle through again, as we all too often do? And the worry, of course, will be that such considerations, the opportunity we have to put health and safety higher up the agenda, the opportunity we have to learn from a deviant situation, be sidelined by the pressures of building business and taking recessionary action. Public Health England's promotion of the policy of mental health, of course, is nobody ever got better from mental health, ill health, by not talking about it. I'll say that again. Nobody ever got better from mental ill health, by not talking about it. So are they idealistic, or should we actually make sure, as we try to put our businesses back into some semblance of a shape, that we don't neglect these things? And a final question which comes across all this, of course, I'm encouraging you to think strategically about home working, but can we actually do strategy across the internet, or do we have to have face-to-face contact? And so that's the fundamental question about all this, is, of course, is we as human beings, is face-to-face contact really a mark of humanity, and therefore we're in really danger of losing sight of that. And of course that extends to all of the social media and all the other things that have changed things so rapidly in the last 20 years. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's wonderful. So now we're going to have a quick question and answer session with Professor Stephen Wood, who's just joined us. Morning, Stephen.
Morning.
And Tobias is also going to join us, our Innovation Fellow.
Hello.
Hi, Tobias. So would you both quickly like to introduce yourselves before we move on to the questions?
Tobias. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Tobias Gould. I'm a Business Innovation Fellow working at the Leicester Innovation Hub. So I'll just answer any questions around hub-based queries.
Great. And Stephen?
Well, I introduced myself at the beginning, but I think they've seen enough of me.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
I believe, the old dictum, it's not what you say, it's what you do that matters.
Okay, so we've had a few questions emailed in. Some people are already typing questions into the meeting chat. If anybody's got any questions, please do. The best way to do is to type it straight into the meeting chat, and we'll try and pick those up. So we have a question. Let's start with Gemma has sent in a question. If you open the meeting chat, you can both see these questions yourself, by the way. So the first question is the open plan office over? It seemed to be very much the trend in recent years, but given the difficulties it will now present, will there be a move back to smaller offices? Very good question.
Do you want me to answer the questions? Is that the idea?
I think so, yes.
Oh yeah, fine. Well, there are people who are going around the world, mainly consultants, arguing that yes, indeed, it's over, and the whole world will become remote. And this discussion was going on before the pandemic, and of course, the pandemic will accelerate trends. One suspects, but the issue we've been raising today, of course, is you can exaggerate this. But equally, there are some very good reasons for having people face to face. So we'll leave those aside. But the more specific question about moving to smaller offices, I suspect that may not happen because it's too costly. But more importantly, if you've got people going at home working, with some people home working some of the week and so on, you can have a lot of empty offices. So it's just not cost effective from a societal point of view, let alone a organizational economics perspective. But I think that people will the middle position, of course, is there'll be, if you like, what we call in blended learning, will be blending working. So people will be working much more mobile. So some people, you're in a cafe one minute, then you're working at home, and then you go back to the office, and this sorts of things. And I think what we may well see, more importantly, is actually people beginning to locate in the cities again. This is the expectation for why cities have grown. We expected 20 years ago cities to decline because of the internet, but in fact the opposite's happened. They become hubs, and this is explaining why people are tending to youngsters especially are coming back to cities and not living in the countryside and so on. So I mean, that might be a bigger trend than actually open plan offices. But I think there will be some discussion, and this actually relates to one of my questions. Will employees have thought a bit more about their work, and then they come back with ideas about how to do their work better? And I think that really answers your question, Gemma. Ultimately, it's a process question. Let's take this advantage for people. Let's take the advantage of this situation to allow people to discuss their offices, how they might make them a bit more healthier and so on. And as you quite rightly say, there's a trigger of social distancing. I don't know what's happening. I think in the open plan offices I know in our university, there probably are 2 meters. And anyway, by the time this discussion comes, then the Prime Minister will have brought it down to 1 meter, I suspect, anyway. So things are changing rapidly. What's your view, Gemma?
Well, we've asked people not to turn on their microphones, so because of for bandwidth options. So hopefully the question is mostly written.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
It's okay. So
you can email me your view, Gemma.
So we've got more questions coming in. The next one, thank you, Gemma. The next one's from Gao Knight. His question: to aid home working, are there any obvious areas for innovation? So it's probably another one for you, Stephen, with possibly Tobias to comment as well.
I'm having difficulty seeing the conversations now. I can see the people, but I can't see the conversation.
Right. Do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I've got the question. I just want
to
look at the. Okay, so innovations for home working.
Yeah, any obvious areas for innovation to aid home working?
I suspect that the main one is ensuring people have got the right equipment, and the IT is the first priority above all else, I suspect. I mean, I don't know whether it's true in your organisations, but you've got a range, I suppose. People who just couldn't work because they had no IT to people who are high tech, but equally they need some support if something goes wrong and so on. So I think that's the main priority. And obviously it's people who, this is the interesting question. We don't know. Lots of we forget there's another group of people, single people who will be sharing flats with 1 or 2 other people, and they may have real problems of working at home because there's only 1 living room and so on. This is another group. So I think again it's a question of people deciding for themselves how best to do it, and the company allowing them to at least discuss these things openly and so on. So that's the big innovation, employee involvement.
Tobias, did you want to comment or?
Well, it just, I guess quite simply that innovation is doing something differently, and we've all been forced to work from home during this period, or many of us have. But I think it's the blended options in the future that will be interesting. I think people will be. I think employers will definitely follow the rules and will have less people in offices, but it's really hard to tell whether these changes are going to carry on for longer. But we need the blended options of a bit of work from home and a bit of getting out and about for our own health, because at the moment it's not a healthy situation. So that's a change, but it's not a change that delivers value for us. So it's not an innovation.
Okay.
And a lot will depend on getting people's getting access to restaurants and all the things we do. When I decided to get in the car the other day just to go literally 2 miles, and it actually ended up right almost outside Dominic Cummings' house, but without realising it till the next day when I saw his house on television. But and I walked around Canterbury as it was, and it's similar to houses where I live, and it was just a change from walking around my locality or cycling in my case. And I came back and I was completely and utterly depressed. It was an anticlimax. Persuaded my wife to get in the car, use the battery and so on. And it was an anticlimax. And I came back and I think, and it's a feeling we've lost so much, and I think that the home working and the blending, which Tobias has just talked about, will only really have really positive effects if recovery time can be recovered, meaningful recovery time, and we're going to have a really long period of transition. There's no point in denying this. It's going to be a long period of transition, and little things like, oh well, we're seeing football back, but it's not the real thing, is it? And so frustrations will carry on and so on. And then we haven't talked about this yet, but and so much of this does depend on the government activity and what kind of government we have and so on. The economy will be taking a long time to recover, and every recession is different. The Great Recession, we saw a stabilization of lower income groups didn't get a great loss of income as normally happens in recessions. It was the other groups that lost. And income stability was quite strong in the last recession, but this time it doesn't look like that, But as I say, every recession is different, so we don't even know what that's going to look like. But I'm sorry to be too pessimistic, but so much depends. But I suppose the message of today is that we have to make sure that those things don't override everything, and which is so often happen in recessions. We haven't used recessions to innovate. In our own organizations, innovate in terms of new opportunities and products and relocation of industry and so on, as in the coal mining industry and so on. But we don't actually we're too frightened in our own organizations to just spend some time thinking. And if we're going to have this blended working, then clearly we have to plan it properly and not just let it happen by topsy.
Okay, thank you. We've got a comment from Dud Hewlett. It's quite an interesting one. The phrase return to work was used on a number of occasions. I think that's wrong. Working from home is real work, just work done from home. Unconsciously, unintentionally, implying working from home is not real work is unhelpful. So
well, that's just a slippage. Then I thought I was saying return to workplace. I take the point, and I'll correct I'm sorry about that. If that's the case, that's completely. That's the nature of doing a one-off video in your own home, and also it may have happened even if I'd done it live, but I apologize if that's the case. But it was meant to be returned to the workplace. In fact, I struggled with this actually. I now recall what happened. I now recall that I did struggle with this a couple of times, and when I was making my notes and so on. And you're absolutely right. Even return to workplace, you might want to argue about that, because my workplace is the home. But we have to. Language is not that flexible, and we have to know what we're talking about. And we were very conscious. At the university, we have key workers, of course. We've got workers who are going in on the coalface, so to speak, and so we're very conscious of it. But I take your point. Thank you very much for correcting me.
That's an interesting point. Okay, next one is from Andrew. Andrew loved the concept of the lockdown providing a mirror on our organisation. How can we capture the key messages the mirror is reflecting in a meaningful way to enable the whole organisation to see the same images, gain shared awareness from which we can develop tools and techniques to inform the business model for the new normal? So it's quite a long question. Did you get that?
I did, yeah.
Great.
Well, I mean, like all these things, when we talk about innovation, commitment, and involvement, we're talking about. We always come back to the central point that without senior management, top management, support, and leadership, these things happen, but they don't happen very effectively, and so on. So that's the first. I'm not necessarily prioritizing these, but sequentially in my mind, that's the first thing you've got to take very seriously. Then the issue of how do we find out this knowledge? How do we get this mirror up, if you like, to put it, to continue the metaphor? It would depend on the size of the organization, of course, isn't it? So if you're a large organization, you probably have to use some surveys with small group discussions of the results. It's called survey feedback method, I suppose. If you're a smaller organization, then you can sit down in the office when you first come back and have a discussion, or you can start to send what's your view of homeworking or whatever. But I think the danger here is that people will say, we'll have a chat in the first hour when everybody comes back. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something has to be fairly structured, that you are sitting down, your mentality as a manager, we're talking here about managers now, is that you are evaluating something
and which means that you try to see what your objectives were and whether they were achieved, and whether there were processes that impeded you even implementing what you were trying to achieve, or whether it was simply that it didn't happen, or whether things did occur. And I suspect the problem you'll realise straight away is they didn't have clear objectives when we locked down for whatever reasons, and that itself is a learning experience and so on. What was the third element of your question? The one that is sort of what moving to the new normal or something. What was the third element of the question?
It was develop tools and techniques to inform the business model for the new normal.
Okay. Well, I think I've probably answered that really. Yes. I mean, we can go into a bit more detail, but I think I would make one point that I've been listening to some of the webinars that are coming from the CIPD and consultants and so, on homeworking, and a lot of them are focused on how to do the homeworking, whereas I think the more important question is what are we learning from it, rather than simply, making sure that you get up. One person talked about the need. Yesterday, I was listening to one briefly. In fact, I switched it off in the end because I was too busy. But the need to make sure you get up and you get up and get dressed, because he had some a video exchange with someone in his, I think it was a man in his pajamas, and he felt that it was unprofessional. He was going to tell him off and so. These things are interesting but important. But the more important thing is what you can learn from it, really, about your employees and so on.
Okay, Tobias, is there anything the hub can do to help with that?
Well, yeah. I think the interesting thing here about the business models is that one of the biggest blocks to innovation and doing things differently is that change is hard, and we've been forced to work so differently, being forced to work in isolation and not be with other human beings. So actually now it's going to be easier to do some aspects of working from home and working from different places. So I think there will just be a little bit more dynamism in how people think about how they deliver businesses, and there will be some interesting new models that come from this forced change.
I think that's raised a point in my mind that we don't know how much of it has gone on, but if people have made quite a big adjustments to the house, for example, they've suddenly decided to actually make a bespoke office, or at least they've taken over part of the house to work and so on. Then that is in itself some kind of innovation, and they may not take kindly to, especially if they've actually done a structural change, like building an office under the stairs or something in the period, and they've invested in this, then they may not take too kindly to be told they've got to come back 100% of the time. And so those are little things that may not be unimportant. We just don't know how many people have made adjustments of that kind, or even whether they've had the time to do it. The other extreme is, of course, where they're working on the breakfast table and they're only too thankful to get back to work.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Questions are coming in thick and fast now. The next one from Arno. Do you think that the idea of the working day is over? It's a nice question.
Well, I've never had one. I've never had anyone working. I don't know. I think it can go both ways, can't it? Because was this directed at me, by the way? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It can go both ways because people will realise the health consequences of not recovering from work. I mean, there's a whole big psychological literature, especially from Germany, about very much the importance of recovery. And I think there's a lot of human differences. My recovery just is enough to watch Newsnight at night is enough for me to recover for the next day. But some people take a lot of recovery, and you can romanticize this. But so that means that we will get back to some semblance of normality. And a lot of the evidence is that. And there's quite a lot of evidence, or anecdotal evidence, that we're receiving more emails from women at night than we used to, and that's because they're kind of working at night, having looked after the kids in the day. It's too black and white, but you get my point. And I think that probably would stop people go back to a more normal thing. The other point, of course, which is very important, is that we may need those hours. We may need to cut back on people's hours as a job sharing process. And there's already talk about the 4-day week, and France has already got it, and other countries, and so that may be another thing. But I think on balance, we certainly won't get. We will get this enthusiasm based. There's always people who are going to be enthusiastically, and then it affects their lives. But that's a sort of almost a separate question. There are workaholics and so on, and that's obviously we have a role model at the top, of course, of our society who is not a workaholic. But leaving that aside, there are enough of us around to. But I think it'll get back. It'll get back to some kind of normality, I think, in terms of that. And it'd be interesting to just know how many people have actually been doing, in inverted commas, a full day's work, because there have been lots of constraints on their working. Some people won't have been able to do their normal work because of IIT or whatever, or they just haven't had the flow of work coming. And others have been overworking. So we don't really actually know how much work has really been going on at home, in fact. So it'll be an interesting question. But as long as the health and the safety agenda is up there, goes up the hierarchy of things, then of course we can't expect to massacre everybody becoming a workaholic, because it's been dampened by well-being experts saying, look, you have to have recovery.
Okay, great. Just moving down, there's a message from Rasha, I think requesting to contact you by email, so perhaps leave that aside for the time being. So another question by Andrew. She's already asked one, so we'll just move on to the next one because we've got so many. So a question from George Oliver. What will be companies' fundamental CSR considerations regarding moving to permanent remote working?
If everybody went to home working, you mean? What's the social responsibility? CSR is corporate social responsibility, is it?
Yes. What will be companies' fundamental CSR considerations regarding moving to permanent remote working?
This is a really good question, not least because I can't answer it. But no, more importantly, I think it raises a really important question about the very first point I made in terms of evaluating what you did at the lockdown, at the event, because there's some really serious questions. I don't even know what my position is in my home insurance. I don't really know what would happen what does happen if you have an accident at home and you're actually at working. It's clearly the employer's responsibility. Well, I don't know. It's an interesting point, isn't it? There's lots of issues here. And I think that the broad answer is the way I've been answering a lot of these points is it's a process, is in process terms. It's up to the organisation to show that they really have actually considered these, not just consider the nitty gritty, but actually have taken some time to understand how best to do this, and they have planned this and thought strategically. And that would be the most corporate socially responsible, and also that they've involved their employees, because I mean the corporate social responsibility stuff is very much led by sort of marketing people and PR and so on. But there's always an underlying point that people make, is that how can you talk about corporate social responsibility if you don't involve your employees much more than we tend to, and so on. So if you've done all that, then I think you've done a good thing. But at the moment, of course, most in the past, home working has just been something. Oh, I'm going to work at home tomorrow, and that's it. And no one the organisation doesn't realise that today we have 20% of people working at home. What does that mean for our organisation, and so on? And what does it mean for their well-being and simple matters about their insurance and so on? I think we're all violating our home insurance. I'm not sure about that, but.
Okay, wonderful.
Can I just say something about social responsibility as well? Because for me, social responsibility is all about doing good. And there's been some new forms of corporations, businesses doing good. Some have pivoted to creating face masks and supplying the NHS or helping their local community. But I actually think probably with lockdown, there's probably less social good going on all over, because a lot of community groups and a lot of volunteering has stopped because people are isolating. So I think while there's some very visible new social responsibility, and the clapping on a Thursday night and helping out your elderly neighbour, I think maybe the net social good has gone down. But it does link back to purpose again. The CSR does give the employees purpose. It makes them feel good about their companies. So I think that the kind of providing meaningful work with blended working from home and doing a social good, it would be lovely if it was all brought together for the future.
Actually, can I just make one point on that? That's a very good point. I think you probably all know, but charities are in a desperate situation because they haven't been getting any revenue because their shops are closed and people don't have enough discretionary income to continue to fund them and so on. And for other, we haven't got any government money either. They're all desperate actually. And the easiest option is to, when you get back to work, you just send some money to a charity, and we've done our corporate social responsibility, which comes back to the central concerns about the whole notion of CSR, that it's a sort of lip service thing, and it's about conscious, making you feel conscious. Resolving your conscience about the ills of the world, or whatever you want to call it, and that would be the easy option, and that's the last thing we want to do. I think, although the charities need the money, it's much better actually get involved in the local community or do something more positive, and use your employees to do it. So, I mean, people do that, of course, these fun runs that people do at work and so on. But I think corporate responsibility, if it's going to mean anything, means something much bigger than this. It means you actually are contributing, and in this case, it's pretty obvious what. People are all contributing by encouraging your employees to stay at home is itself by encouraging home working and making it easy during the pandemic. You've been acting in a corporately social responsible way, unlike the number 10 office, for example.
Well, moving swiftly on. Another comment by, we're running out of time actually, but we'll try and get another couple of questions in. Dud Hewlett's made another comment offering the civil service as an excellent example of remote working. It's quite interesting. A question from Gal Naik. Do you think e-learning technologies will evolve at a greater pace as a consequence of this COVID experience, including at universities?
Well, I don't particularly want to. Are you at a university, by the way? You're a businessman, a businesswoman, right?
Gal works for a business advice service, I think.
Okay.
Business support service.
Yes, I mean, just to get the university thing out of the way, I'm not a great fan of talking about your own neck of the woods, as it were. But yeah, I mean, we know that from that Cambridge is going totally e-learning for 6 months, and we're doing it at the University of Leicester and so on. But I don't think that's necessarily a permanent change at all. But the evidence on e-learning, which I don't know enough about because there isn't that much. A lot of it's anecdotal, and the civil service talk. Whenever you go to the EOC, for example, they talk a lot about the fact that e-learning doesn't work and it doesn't have a big effects. And there is a sort of, the jury's out on it, and I personally find it when I've had to do things like health and safety, I just don't rate it. I think it is, one of the reasons, of course, is because there's the old-fashioned point about if you don't use that knowledge that you gain in a training program fairly straight, and it's reinforced by activities and reinforced by your line managers, it has no effect and so on. So I'm not a great fan of e-learning as a sort of recipe. Now it does have its role, I suspect, but I think much more interactive things like these webinars they do have it. That is where the internet can work. I think these. I've been involved in some webinars with several people. The best ones are the Royal Economic Society. Economists are very good at presenting. I don't know what it is about them. I think they're not that keen on face-to-face interaction, but they seem to be great on these videos, and you really do learn a lot. I'd spend all day talking about what I'd learned in a half an hour on a thing. During the clapping, for example, last night, I was telling them all about what this health economist was saying, and it was riveting stuff. And I really did learn something. It's really held in my mind. And that point I made today about recessions being different, I picked that up from that webinar. But I think there's some mechanical technology thing. I'm not a fan of it in the first place, but that doesn't mean it's not going to take off. But this is back to the central point of what I've been saying today. And I just said it's a lazy method. It's a lazy method. And it may not in the long run be it may be cost very cheap, because you can get lots of people, but the cost benefit ratio may be very low. There's no benefit from it, and you're just having people sitting behind a screen in their office or at home learning about health and safety or something, and it's just that's a lot of cost, actually, having people spending an hour behind a so-called learning experience and so on. So I hope, I mean, I suppose I'm not supposed to be like a government scientific advisor. I'm not supposed to offer my hopes, but they do offer hopes on in the press releases. So in the press sessions. So I hope it doesn't really take off, because it's it's got to be done much better than it is at the moment. Yeah. Well, actually, to reinforce my point, there's not enough user involvement in these things. It's the same across the whole IT. From my experience in universities, especially, there's still not enough user involvement. This whole thing about employee involvement started with Edith Mumford and people like this about computers. When we introduced computing, people were saying, and the socio-technical system model took off. It had been around for years, but it really took off in the age of when computers first came. We must involve the user, but we haven't seen a lot of it. It's a classic example. And so if you're going to have e-learning tools, involve users beforehand, pilot them and so on.
Okay, and there's a sort of a link to the next question. Thanks, Gav, for that question. Next question from Tim L. Sheikh. Could this also become the time where the use of AI and automation will accelerate, which of course will result in significant job losses? We already see this trend in manufacturing. That must mean the time's up.
No, that's the guy who sits next to me at football has just phoned me. Are you going to give your subscription to the charity, or are you going to get your money back for your season ticket? Sorry about that. I did actually wake up this morning and say I must put my mobile phone on thing. Anyway, it's fun. You've learned a bit more about me and the real priorities in life of people. Well, it does illustrate my point. You know, the people are trying to get back to normal. And anyway, I mean, this is an area, AI, if I was a youngster, I'd be getting into it. But at my age, I decided consciously it's just too complicated. I've tried to get into the impact of mobile information technology on work-life balance, and that's a whole quagmire of stuff which I'm getting into and trying to understand a bit more about. Because the simple idea that the use of mobile technology leads to conflict at home just is ridiculous. It's just this, and that's where we are at the moment in that area. So, and you need to know what is it about the digital technology that makes for an environment that may or may not lead to blurring of the work-family thing. So I'm getting into that, but I'm sort of conscious that I won't get into AI. I'm too old, you know, and the investment is too great. So I don't even, I mean, I know roughly what it is, but I should say, I've been involved in the debates about automation in I won't tell you how, since when, but you know, every 10 years there's going to be a new technology transform the world. And it does and it doesn't, you know. And it's hard even to explain how the internet has changed the world. It clearly has, but people have never seen anything really great about how it's changed the world. But on the job point, again, the lessons are that, of course, the actual new innovation brings about a reduction of jobs and a change of jobs. So the assembly line reduced the craftsman's job, but equally a completely new group of unskilled, semi-skilled workers emerged, and also skilled workers to maintain the assembly line and so on. So whatever new technologies we've had in the history, we don't necessarily see a job loss, and I think that's the whole point about AI. It will obviously automate things or whatever it does, but there'll be plenty of jobs involved in the actual AI, and so I think the job loss thing will be. I mean, I'm being optimistic, but I mean it's not going to be a massive great. We've had this every time there's a new technology. It's going to be no people, and we've seen the great growth of the IT industry and so on driving the internet. So the same thing will happen with AI. There'll be new people. It'll be just extension of the IT fraternity, I suppose. But so I don't think. And whether the pandemic will the most obvious point about whether the pandemic will accelerate attention towards AI, the answer would be probably not, because the economy will be, and the real danger is this government will go back to its rather it'll force itself, or maybe it's got such tunnel vision it won't be able to adapt. The real key is not AI. The key is to focus everything on the climate change issue, which has a fantastic positive effect. What's called a super multiplier in economics. It increases investment and consumption at the same time, and that's what we should be hanging on to. And in the short term, it has amazing effects. If all the short term things you do, like insulating houses and planting trees and so on, it is actually extremely job creating, because you can't import these people. You can import the labour, but you can't import the labour will be indigenous. It will be in our country. It's not, you can't sort of buy in trees. I mean, you can buy the roots, but you can't buy the planting and so on. So it's not an import thing. And so that has a very big short-term effects. If we had a really conscious climate change program in the next 3 years, we could really create some jobs.
Okay. Thank you very much.